Hello, today I'm going to talk about how to hook up gauges and get a reading on an AC system. When it comes to air conditioning systems, the number one tool that you can use to help diagnose a improperly functioning system is system pressures. And the best way to get system pressures to help guide your diagnosis is by hooking up a manifold gauge set. This is an example of one gauge set. There's different types. They vary in style and look, but they all function the same. And once you know how to hook up one, you've pretty much got it. So with a gauge set, generally you're going to have a hook so that you can hang it for easy reference. But you'll have two dials on them. And if you look here, we have a blue dial and a red dial. The blue dial is going to be our low side pressures, and the red dial will be our high side pressures. Each side, you see there's three hoses running off this. There's a blue hose to hook up to our low side service port, and a red hose to hook up to the high side service port. Now, all AC gauges operate the same. They hook up the same way. You'll see that the end that hooks up to the service port has a couple parts to it. There's a dial here on the back side that can turn in and out, and then you have a spring-loaded collar. And this is very similar to the airlines in the shop when you hook up an air tool to the airlines. You have to pull back on the collar to put it on the service port, and then let go of the collar and double check that it's on nice and snug. This will help keep the line hooked up to the AC kind of as a fail-safe or a backup. So once you hook this up to the car, then you're going to screw this valve in until it stops. Once this valve is screwed in all the way, then the system is open to the hose. When you first hook this line up to the car and this valve is all the way back out, the freon is not, or the refrigerant is not going to be allowed to get into the hose. This initial step of the collar is just to lock the hose to the service port, and then when you screw in this dial, that's when the refrigerant is allowed to enter the hoses. So before you start using an AC gauge set to hook up on a car, the first step I like to do is to make sure that these valves are screwed out. Make sure that they are all the way out before you attempt to hook it up to the car. So as soon as you pick up your gauge set, when you're getting ready to do an AC pressure reading or do a performance check on an AC system, first thing you do, make sure these, it's the same on both, make sure both dials are all the way out, and make sure the valves on the gauge set are closed. Then you're ready to hook it up to the car. The dials and the valves on these gauge sets, they turn real easy most of the time. Everything we do with these gauges is just finger tight. There's no need to really crank down on this and tighten it down until you can't get it off. And when you're backing it out, as soon as it bottoms out and reaches that stop, that's fine. You don't have to try and keep going and really crank on these valves. Finger tight is all you need to do on these. So we have our gauge set. We have our two ports. The next thing are the two attachment points. The next thing we need to do is locate the high and low side service ports on the vehicle. This can be a challenge sometimes. They're hidden all over the place. But this one, it's pretty easy. You're just going to follow the high and the low AC lines until you find two little plastic caps. Once you find these plastic caps, you can take them off. You'll be tempted to place them somewhere in the engine compartment. A lot of people will take them off and immediately set them somewhere in the engine compartment, but they get lost very easy. I like to, if I'm going to have an AC machine or something around me, I like to put them on the AC machine or somewhere away from the engine compartment so they don't get lost. Just make sure they go somewhere where you know where they're at. So now that we've located our service ports and we are ready to hook up to the car, we can take our hose, pull back on the collar, locate the low side fitting, push it on, and you'll hear the click of the collar lock back down into place. Now I'm going to hook up my high side. Hear a slight hiss as the refrigerant enters the hoses. You will also notice that the pressures on the gauges will now shoot up. So our pressures here, they should be about equal because the system is at rest, the car is not running, and the AC system hasn't been operated for quite some time. So on this one, both pressures are at 90 degrees, high and low side. So these initial pressures can vary with ambient temperature. It's pretty hot in the shop today, so our static pressures are pretty high. These are all the way up at 90. Most of the time they're going to be 70, 80 psi, but with the added heat load in the shop today, they're all the way up at 90. So we have similar static pressures on high and low. These valves are still closed, but our gauges are still reading. These valves are what expose the hoses to the other part of this manifold here. The pressure of the refrigerant is still going to be read with these closed. I'll show you what we do with these when we're getting ready to remove them from the vehicle. For right now, we just want to make sure that these are still closed. All right, so we have our gauges hooked up to the car. The valves are open and we're seeing a static pressure. One thing you want to do when you're hooking up AC lines is you see we have a lot of this rubber hose hanging around here. Make sure you route these hoses away from any moving parts because we are going to be starting this car and running it. So make sure all the hoses are routed away from the serpentine belt or any moving or rotating parts. Just make sure they're routed nice and out of the way. The next step is going to be to get in the car, start the car, turn the AC on to max, and then come and we'll get a pressure reading. So here we are. The high side is reading just under 200 psi. And the low side is reading about 44 psi. Now I have the AC set on max, so we should be able to watch the system start to cycle as the compressor kicks on and on. Now, if we had an issue with the system, we would be able to monitor the pressures and test the operation of the system and make sure the dash is blowing cold. That is what we call an AC performance test. I'm going to do another video on AC performance test. So the next step after hooking up the gauges would be to actually check the functionality of the AC system. But for this, it was just to hook up the gauges and to take them off. So now we'll say we've already got our readings, we're ready to go. Now we need to take the gauges off. But if you notice, we have that almost 200 psi of refrigerant in this line and about 40 psi still in the low side. So what we need to do before we remove these gauges is we're going to want to clear the high side as much as we can. So to do that, we're going to want to turn the high side off from the gauges. And to do that, we just back the high side valve back out. So now the high side is no longer connected to the system on the car. So now we can go in and we will open the high side valve to bleed the high pressure into the low side. And now we'll be able to open the low side valve to let the low side suck that pressure in from the gauge. So the pressure just increased up to about 90 psi on the low side. And then it came back down into the 40 psi that it was before. So now, once these gauges have reached their lowest point, so they're both just over 40 psi, so now I can shut both valves. And I'm ready to go ahead and take the hoses off the car. So I'm going to back the valve off the low side, double check the high side, and now I'm able to remove the hoses. The high side should never be stored with that 200 psi in there. We want to make sure we bleed that high pressure off into the low side. A little word of warning: when you're removing the hoses from the car, sometimes you'll get a little burst of refrigerant. That's normal. That's just the refrigerant that was trapped in the hose venting. It's a very small amount, and it's not going to do any damage. Another thing I want to point out: if you're worried about which fitting to hook the hose up to, you might not want to mix them up. The high side and the low side fittings are different sizes, so they only go on one way. So don't worry too much about that. Just pay attention to which one is the larger one and which one is the smaller one when you're hooking them up. All right, so that's the proper way to hook up the AC manifold gauge set, and then to take it off once you're done getting your reading. Hope you learned something, and see you next time.